Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started here. I want to welcome everyone for joining us today for our virtual Mind Walk lecture series. My name is Francesca Mannheim. I'm a California State Park interpreter with the San Luis Obispo Coast District. And today I'm really excited to have a great presentation for you. We've got Carolyn Geraghty here from the Morro Bay Estuary program. But before we introduce her, I want to introduce this series. I know some of you have attended a lot of these walks. These virtual mind walks are a lecture series that are hosted by California State Parks and the Central Coast State Parks Association, or CCSPA. They are hosted twice a month on Fridays and are free for all to attend. You can check out our list of upcoming talks here on this website on our screen. And they're also being recorded. So if you need to duck out early today, or if you really want to share this information with a friend or a family member, once it gets recorded next week, it will get posted to our website. And the virtual Mind Walk program is underwritten by the Thomas E. and Mary Catherine Ellsroth Fund, and it's supported by the Central Coast State Parks Association. For today's presentation, it will be about 30 minutes long, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And if you want to ask the presenter a question, you can use the chat function or the Q&A function along the bottom or side of your screen, depending on your device. We'll probably hold off on questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll make sure we try to get to all of your questions. If you have any questions about the tech, you can type in your question into there as well. And today's program, again, will be recorded, so feel free if you need to duck out early and ask questions later through email, that is fine also. And if you'd like to help support the virtual Mind Walk program or other state park educational opportunities, you can check out the link here along the bottom in blue, and that's centralcoastparks.org/friends for CCSPA's Friends program to learn more about how you could donate to these programs or receive some other perks. So let's introduce our speaker here. We can stop sharing for a second if you want, Carolyn. And today we have Carolyn Geraghty, who is the Restoration Projects Manager at the Morro Bay National Estuary Program. She develops and oversees the watershed and estuarine restoration projects and conservation efforts. Thanks so much for being here today, Carolyn, and feel free to take it away.
Great, thank you so much. All right, well, good afternoon. My name is Carolyn Geraghty with the Morro Bay National Estuary Program. I'm really excited to share some projects that we've been working on related to eelgrass restoration and climate resiliency in the Morro Bay watershed. So before I dive into those projects, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about who we are. The Morro Bay National Estuary Program is a nonprofit, and we are part of a network of 28 other national estuary programs throughout the US designated by the EPA. And we bring together citizens, government, and nonprofits and landowners to protect and restore Morro Bay. And we have three main programs, restoration and conservation. That's the program that I lead, outreach and education, and then also some extensive monitoring and research. And we work in the Morro Bay watershed, which you can see here. The red outline shows the Morro Bay watershed, and there are two primary tributaries, the Chorro Creek and Los Osos Creeks, both drain into the Morro Bay estuary here. And I'll primarily be focusing on our work in the estuary. So why is eelgrass important? Eelgrass is important for both people and wildlife. Many fish and invertebrates live within the eelgrass beds. Invertebrates can lay their eggs directly on the blades. And there's also birds like the black brant geese that feed directly on eelgrass. And eelgrass can also help with water quality by uptaking nutrients. And the roots from eelgrass can also help to stabilize the sediment and help with water clarity. Eelgrass also stores carbon, so it can help with ocean acidification, and it can also damper waves when you're thinking about flooding and things like that. So it has a lot of benefits. Eelgrass can grow in two different ways. It can grow both through a horizontal root system to grow horizontally, and then it also produces seeds that disperse with the tides. Eelgrass grows in many places around the world. This is a map of the West Coast, and you can see in the green dots where eelgrass is present. You can see Morro Bay here. And we are unique in that we have eelgrass in Morro Bay, and there isn't a lot of adjacent other estuaries that help eelgrass. And this is important when thinking about like the Pacific Flyway, for example. So eelgrass acreage in Morro Bay has fluctuated over time. This chart shows eelgrass acreage starting from 1960 to 2020. It's important to note that there have been a number of different methods used to track eelgrass coverage. Back in the day, people were out with kayaks, and then we've done more with multispectral mapping. We've done sonar mapping, and more recently, we've also used drones as well. And you can see in the 90s, there was a pretty large drop in eelgrass coverage in the estuary, and this was attributed to a wildfire in the watershed that was followed by a heavy rain event that brought about 2 feet of sediment to parts of the bay, basically smothered the habitat that was there. And it took about a decade for eelgrass to rebound. And then we've had a more recent die-off, and that's what I'm going to focus on for this presentation. So this map series shows eelgrass at its last peak at 344 acres in fall 2007. And then you can see that eelgrass has died off mostly in the mid and back bay of the estuary. And then in 2018, we saw small little patches coming back. And you can see we went from 13 acres to 43 acres in 2019. In fall 2020, we recorded 146 acres. So we are excited to see more eelgrass coming back. And we are currently mapping some drone images that were collected by Cal Poly. We have some funding through Restore America's Estuaries Coastal Watershed Grant to do additional map. And unfortunately, we're a few weeks shy of finishing that. But looking at the draft, it does look like we have even more acreage of eelgrass from last fall. This is what that decline looks like in images. Here is a photo from 2010, 2012, 15, and then 2021. You can see a lot more eelgrass coverage and then also a lot of macroalgae coming back. So the question we get most is what caused the most recent decline? And unfortunately, we don't have one factor that we can point to attribute it to the decline, and it's likely a combination of factors. And there's a lot of different factors that do impact eelgrass collectively. And so I'll go over some of these impacts that could affect eelgrass. So the first thing is turbidity. Eelgrass needs light to grow. So if the water clarity is too turbid, it can affect their photosynthesis. And this could be from sediment from the watershed, or maybe resuspension of sediment from the bottom of the estuary, recirculating into the water column. As I mentioned in the 90s, sediment can also come down from the watershed and smother eelgrass, and that would impact drying of the blades. Adverse water quality can also impact eelgrass, such as high temperatures, acidic conditions, and low oxygen levels. Macroalgae can also smother eelgrass if there's too much. And wasting disease can also impact eelgrass. There's a slime mold that can be virulent under certain conditions. And there can also be biological impacts. And again, these wouldn't be at such a large scale, like we've seen eelgrass decline in Morro Bay, but crabs can clip the blades, and then the black brant geese can also feed on the blades, but they usually don't feed too far down, and the meristem of the eelgrass plant is still there to be able to grow back. And on more of a localized scale, sometimes we can have pure shading that can impact eelgrass, and also localized dredging of the bay. So it's important to monitor that closely. So with this large scale eelgrass decline, the estuary program has been working with a number of partner agencies and research groups to better understand what conditions are suitable for eelgrass in the bay and complete the number of restoration efforts. So there's been a lot of research with Cal Poly and Cuesta over the last 5 to 8 years, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the things that we have been studying after we saw this large scale decline. So we looked at the diversity of eelgrass and found that the eelgrass that was present is still very diverse. Cal Poly has some sensors in the bay looking at different water quality parameters, and they found that the back bay at times does have limited circulation with low oxygen levels, higher temperatures, and more saline conditions at times. Cuesta College is doing some work with eelgrass wasting disease, and it is present in our bay. And we've also been doing some work looking at the bathymetry of the bay and how elevations have changed. And we found that erosion in the bay has occurred after that large scale loss of eelgrass, but possibly has reset favorable depths for eelgrass. Eelgrass grows at very shallow depths in Morro Bay compared to some other estuaries. So it's possible that that was beneficial for eelgrass. Here is a map of Morro Bay showing bathymetry, sort of the topography of the estuary. And you can see in these darker blue areas, these show areas of erosion where there was loss of sediment. Again, eelgrass roots hold sediment into the soil. So with that large scale loss of eelgrass, we did anticipate seeing some erosion, and we're able to capture that through this bathymetry mapping. So the second question we get a lot is, why is eelgrass coming back? And it's possible that some of the conditions that support healthy eelgrass have changed in these years. As I mentioned, there's a lot of water quality parameters that affect eelgrass, for example, and the elevation has also changed. So there's some things that have changed in that time. And then we've also been completing a number of restoration efforts for the last 6 years, and that will be a focus of this talk. There was some restoration efforts a few years before this, about 2014, with Merkel and Associates, fairly large-scale restoration efforts. And unfortunately, much of that did not work. And so the Estuary program, again, wanted to partner with agencies to do things more at a small scale and better understand conditions in the bay and how best to complete restoration efforts. So some of the pilot scale testing that we've completed over the last 5 years or so, we looked at the timing of planting of eelgrass, a range of depths, a range of donor beds, and a few different methods. Our collection methods have been fairly consistent over the years. We've mostly been collecting eelgrass by hand on foot at low tides, and sometimes we've also collected with scuba. We've done this with estuary program staff, Tenera Environmental, as well as a number of volunteers. So we're very grateful for our volunteers that have helped over the years. Once we collect eelgrass, we check the rhizome lengths, and we count before planting to track success at each of our sites. So over the last 6 years, these are all of the sites that we have planted, and I'll walk you through each of these years. So the first year was in 2017. This is a little bit after I started with the estuary program. And we wanted to test seasonality of planting, as previously most eelgrass had been planted in the summer. And we'd heard from other estuaries that they had had better success in the spring. And we had 2 sites this year. One site that was closer to the mouth of the channel where eelgrass had been doing better, and then more of an experimental site in the middle of the bay. And the site in the middle of the bay did not work at either summer or spring, but we did find that the site closer to the mouth of the bay did much better when we planted in the spring rather than in the summer. Here's an example of a 1-meter plot that we planted, and we anchored eelgrass into the sediment. And these 4 photos show 4 different plots of that site in the forebay when we planted in the summer. And then this next slide shows the exact same location 18 months after in the spring. So you can see that everything was the same except for the time of year. So that year we learned that it's much better to plant in the spring, and we've moved forward with that since then. In 2018, we decided to test more locations throughout the bay. So we had 5 different locations, and we also tried a new method with these rebar pieces. And we found that both methods are feasible and all of the sites were successful. Here you can see a rebar piece. It's 3 feet long with a small bent end that sticks into the sediment. And we remove the rebar 6 months after it's planted. At this site, we had 3 rebar pieces here, and this is 2 years after. You can see it formed a nice bed. And this on the right had 3 1-meter plots planted. And this is 2 years after, and this is along the main tidal channel in Morro Bay. In 2019, we continued to plant with plots and rebar pieces, and we tested a range of depths. We tested no anchoring, and we tested planting via snorkeling, whereas before we had done mostly everything on foot. We found that deeper sites were slightly more successful, and we also found that not anchoring some of the sites when we were planting at low tides was also successful. And we did have 2 sites out of the total that were not successful. So here's an example of a site where we put 3-meter plots that were anchored and 3 that weren't anchored to look at the difference. And 1 year after, all of those 6 plots were doing fairly well. This chart shows the difference between anchoring and unanchoring. So this is just an example of how each year we're trying to learn, do small scale restoration and learn from the prior year. So we had 2 different sites where we tested this at. Some were anchored and some were not anchored. And you can see that there's fairly similar between this one site and then the second site. Same thing, fairly similar results. But we do see fairly different results between these 2 sites. And it does seem to be that depth does play a factor there. This was a shallow site and this was a lot deeper site. This is another site where we looked at the depth of planting. So we had a shallow site, what we call the middle site, and a deep site. And it does look like, again, the deeper sites are having higher survival. In 2020, we did additional sites. We only had 1 site that had partial success. Otherwise, all sites were successful. We tested a new method with these bamboo pieces and did more subtidal plantings with scuba. Here's what these these bamboo pieces look like. We tied jute string around the roots, and then we stuck those into the ground. Okay, and finally in 2021, this was our biggest effort so far. You can see a lot of eelgrass has come back, and we were kind of extending into the middle of the bay. And so we really focused on using bamboo pieces because they were the fastest and least impact the estuary. And our lessons learned for that year was there actually was a lot of eelgrass, coming back, and that did actually make monitoring more challenging. When we were trying to go back and look at the success of what we planted, we were surprised at the natural recruitment adjacent to these sites. So in summary, for our restoration efforts, we ended up in total having 41 different sites. We did plant 2 sites this spring, and then given even more eelgrass coming back in here that's not showed on this map, we decided to wrap up our efforts with those 2 sites and not do any additional restoration efforts. We've done both intertidal and subtidal depths. We've harvested from 4 different donor beds and planted over 15,000 plants. And the majority of the sites have thrived. There have been a couple that haven't been successful. Initially, we had a site that wasn't successful, likely due to the season that we planted it. we've had some sites that maybe were on the shallower end of what's ideal for eelgrass. And more recently, we've had some concerns of macroalgae. Macroalgae has been increasing in the bay, similar to eelgrass, but in some areas, it does seem to be outcompeting eelgrass. And we have a goal of having 313 acres of eelgrass in the bay, and this is based on existing elevations and historic coverage. So now I'd like to kind of transition into looking at the physical and biological changes with increase in eelgrass habitat. This is something that we'd like to explore more now, given this large increase in eelgrass habitat. I mentioned that we did complete a bathymetry survey looking at elevations of the bay, and we have funding to do another survey this summer and see if there's any changes, for example, like capturing of sediment with this increase in eelgrass. We've also been doing increased water quality and nutrient monitoring with Cal Poly, and we're hoping to keep that going. And they also are going to be having some results of looking at water quality both within and out of eelgrass beds, and see the benefits of, hopefully the benefits of eelgrass to water quality. Switching to biological impacts, the state parks mentioned that a lot of folks ask about the black brant geese, and this is a geese that flies from Alaska and overwinters in Morro Bay from November to April. And there's a citizen scientist, John Roser, who's been monitoring black brant observations. And State Parks was mentioning that a lot of people do have questions about how black brant geese have changed. And this shows a chart of brant numbers over the last 24 years based on John Roser's data. And unfortunately, he was not able to do it this year. I think this was 2021 was going to be his last year. So I think they're going to switch to just measuring black brant geese in January, like a once a year measurement. But it does seem anecdotally, a lot of folks are up on the bay and seeing a lot more brant geese, it seems like, so that's great. I guess one aside is that black brant geese can have been shown sometimes to increase when eelgrass habitat increases, since it is their food source. However, with climate change, the habitat has also changed in Alaska where they are feeding. So some of the wetlands or ponds where they feed up in Alaska, they're not iced over for as long of the year, or maybe not at all with climate change. So more black brant geese are actually staying up in Alaska and not coming down to Morro Bay to overwinter. So that might be a bigger impact to the numbers that we see in Morro Bay. We would also like to put some more effort into monitoring fish and how that has changed with an increase in eelgrass habitat. Jennifer O'Leary, she was with the Sea Grant at Cal Poly, and she had monitored in 2016, looking at shifts in fish communities that require eelgrass habitat, such as smelt, pipefish, sole, and perch, to those that do not, like gobies and sand-dubs. So I don't have any interesting data to share about that, but we're looking at potentially getting some funding to look at this. So I will wrap up with discussing a little bit about climate change impacts to eelgrass and estuary habitats. So climate change will probably have a number of physical effects to the estuary and the watershed. Some of them will be ocean acidification, sea level rise, increased storminess, and wildfires, leading to possible sediment impacts, increased temperature, and increased drought. So I'll just touch on a couple of these. So when thinking about ocean acidification, this is excess CO2 that makes the ocean more acidic. And this makes it more difficult for marine life to build their shells and skeletons, and also means fewer crustaceans, shellfish, and zooplankton for birds and other wildlife to eat. However, eelgrass does absorb CO2 and methane and stores it in its roots, so it can act as a buffer to ocean acidification, which is a good thing. So we definitely want to keep the eelgrass healthy. Thinking about sea level rise, this chart shows some possible future sea level rise levels, depending on different emission scenarios. So there's usually updated guidance, every few years. This is just showing, it really depends on kind of our mission scenarios and what we're planning for in the bay. So this slide has a lot going on, but it's just to show that there are more local data for sea level rise. This is from an Ocean Protection Council report from 2018. It's easy to find online if you want to dive in further. And I've just pulled out an example from this report. It talks about a 66% probability in 2100 of having, for example, like a 2 to 3 feet increase in sea level rise for Port San Luis, depending on the level of emissions. If you're interested in looking at some maps of sea level rise, the USGS has a coastal storm modeling system called Cosmos, a model that they're using to look at coastal flooding. And you can go to the Our Coast, Our Future website and choose hazard map. And you can get maps where you can choose like a level of sea level rise and the amount of storm frequency, for example, and look at areas that might be vulnerable in the future. So here you can see some flooding of the sandspit. I think there's some other areas along Barcadera that are a little more vulnerable. Windy Cove here. Here's the south part of the bay. You can see some areas that might be more vulnerable here with sea level rise. So again, that's our Coast, Our Future website, and you can scroll around and choose different scenarios to look at. So sea level rise will impact a number of different habitats in the bay. Since I was just talking about eelgrass, I was just mentioned that right now eelgrass has about a 3 feet to 1 meter depth range. And I think there's definitely room for eelgrass to move into deeper depths in the bay. But we are interested in modeling and better understanding sea level rise impacts to eelgrass, as eelgrass does grow in a very narrow depth range, similar to other habitats that have their own depth ranges. So continuing to think about climate change in estuary habitats, another possible impact of sea level rise is possible sand spit migration, as there's increased waves on the sand spit, and the height of those waves could move the sand spit more inland. We're also looking at marsh migration space. So the tidal marshes are kind of along the fringe of the bay, and there's sort of the big delta marsh where Los Osos Creek and Chorro Creek come into the estuary. And we're thinking about conversion of habitats. So right now, all these habitats grow at a very narrow band of elevation, and that would change with sea level rise. And sediment accumulation in these areas is important when we look at modeling of these habitats and how they might change. We've been working with the University of San Francisco and USGS to look at current levels of sediment in the tidal marsh and some of the mudflat areas. We use sediment elevation tables and horizon markers to do this. And the USGS completed a study a few years ago looking at some preliminary modeling of this delta area. And you can see here where there's low, mid, and high marsh, these different elevations within the marsh. And if you look with sea level rise, this is under current conditions where we have low, mid, and high marsh. And then when you go to 2050 and 2110, you can see that a lot of this habitat converts to mudflat under sea level, current sea level rise projections. This is taken from that same report, and they looked at other estuaries along the California coastline. And you can see that's pretty common for the other estuaries as well, where we're seeing this transition to subtidal habitats and even open water habitats. So the estuary program right now is really focusing on getting some funding to do sea level rise planning. We'd like to review existing data and collect new data to inform modeling for upland transition zones, tidal marsh, mudflat, eelgrass, and sandspit ecosystems. Then we would model future outcomes considering several different sea level rise scenarios, sediment availability, storm surge, and then linkages between these different habitats. And then finally, we would identify, model, and plan possible nature-based management scenarios that can be implemented. So this would engage a number of different partners and agencies around the estuary, potentially looking at transition space or sediment augmentation is one management strategy that some other estuaries have used to try to build up the tidal marsh elevation. One of those estuaries is Seal Beach, where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been doing some pilot studies looking at the layer augmentation. Naturally, tidal marshes are able to keep up with sea levels, but since we have accelerated sea level, they're doing some studies to see how vegetation will respond to this sediment addition. So I'd again like to thank all the partners that have been working with us on the work I presented. We definitely couldn't do any of this without them. And if you're interested in learning more, we have a nature center that's open daily on the waterfront. You can subscribe to our weekly blog, and that's also available on our website if you want to browse. We talk about all different projects and wildlife on the blog. You can also follow us on social media. We will be probably posting a new eelgrass map from December in the next month or so, or maybe 2 months, and have an updated acreage on eelgrass. That'll be exciting for us to share. And here's my contact information. I'm glad to answer questions that you have now. And if we don't cover everything, I'm happy to chat with you later.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thanks for sharing all of that. That's really impressive work that you've been doing and your whole team there has been doing. We had a couple questions come in. One earlier in regards to your restoration work. Someone was asking, could some of the natural recruitment have been from seeds of plants that were planted?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, we think about the planting as like that one site, and then also sort of creating little nodes where like the seeds can disperse and start natural recruitment adjacent to those areas for sure.
Very cool. And then of course we did have a couple questions come in about Brandt's geese.
Okay.
You did address kind of about their population. That was a really interesting graph to see. I definitely want to get a print out of that to have at our museum. And super interesting about the tundra melting and how climate change is affecting their population and their migration route, and thinking about these migratory species changing, whether their population and migration routes changing. But another question came in about Brandt's. Is most of the nutrition in eelgrass from the blades themselves or the critters that live on the blades for the Brandt?
That's a quick question. I think it's just the blade themselves is my understanding, but I'm sure sometimes there's small critters on the blades, but I would think it's probably from the blades themselves. I've seen them like, yeah, they basically just like mow it, to where they live like little stumps left. They're mostly hanging out in the back bay where there isn't as much, potential disturbance. Like in the forebay, there's just a lot more going on in terms of recreation and folks. But I think when we had really low eelgrass numbers, like 13 acres, there was observance of them eating tile marsh plants. So I think they did move to other habitats, but it does seem like there's plenty of eelgrass out there for them right now.
Good to hear that. And then let's see this next question, again, complimenting your work. Great work. Are there other estuaries that are collaborating? Also, is there a trigger of events or metrics that would bring back your planting project?
Yeah, we do talk with a lot of other estuaries, like at conferences or just more informally. Elkhorn Slough, for example, or like some other, the Southern California estuary, San Francisco estuary. Some of our planting methods came from some work up in Washington State. So there's also was an interesting like restoration report that that the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Research Foundation did this year. looking at restoration results and methods and things like that. So there is a lot of sharing of information. And in terms of if we would start restoration again, if there's like a tipping point. So we're hoping to just continue to monitor eelgrass maybe annually or biannually and try to see if there's differences. We do have other eelgrass monitoring that's going on about twice a year at some established beds and some permanent plot areas where we're able to track changes, at least in those localized areas, but would tell a story for the larger part of the bay. And we're hoping to keep a lot of the monitoring that was up and running over the last 5 years. We're hoping to keep as much of that going as we can, because we are seeing potentially some impacts with macroalgae, like I mentioned, where some areas, the density of eelgrass has declined, and that's more anecdotal when we've been out there ground truthing for the bay-wide map. But we are definitely keeping our eye on some areas to see how things are changing each year.
Very interesting. Well, I think that's all the questions we have. If anyone else that's on wants to type something in real quick here before we wrap up. Otherwise, thanks for sharing your contact info, Carolyn. And I also really recommend signing up for their newsletter and their blog. I'm always learning new things from this monthly blog post, and they really go in depth on different species and different restoration projects. So yeah, big supporter of your organization and happy to partner with you.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate your time.
Perfect. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions. We'll go ahead and wrap up. And again, this will be recorded and will be posted within the next week or so. But we want to thank all of you so much for your time today. Thank you, Carolyn, for being here with us and for all the work that you do for our bay.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Well, bye, everyone. Thank
Bye.
you.